All right. Well, welcome again to another Devo with Patrick and Jamie. This is Jamie, and I am glad that you have decided to spend a little bit of time with us today as we go through God's Word, through the Bible. Patrick, how you doing today?
I am doing well. Happy Sunday. I know it doesn't feel like Sunday, but it is. You know, another week has gone by, and we're looking at the Psalms on Sundays, and personally, I think the Psalms are great, but sometimes they are hard to talk about. I don't know why. At some of them, it's just kind of, you read it and you're like, that was a good word. Moving on. Yeah. And the one we're going to look at today, I don't think is really like that, but it is only 5 verses. And I want to just say, Psalms that are short are very satisfying to read because you finish it and you're like, I just read a chapter of a book. You know, sometimes I'll sit down, like today I sat down to read a chapter of a book and I read it for an hour and a half. We're going to read the whole chapter in less than a minute. So Psalm 15, 1-5 at the beginning. It's a Psalm of David, 5 verses.
I'm ready.
All right. It says this, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor, and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person, but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, and does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
And just like that, a chapter of the book down.
You just read an entire chapter of the Bible. That sounds impressive. But it's 5 verses.
So verse 1, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? I would love to live in the Lord's sacred tent. That sounds awesome. I love camping though. So some people tent camping, they're like, not for me. For me, it's like, take away my house, I'll live in a tent. That sounds awesome.
You would like that.
I could probably go 3 months living in a tent before I was like, okay, I'm kind of over this.
I lived for every week for spring break while I was in high school and 2 years in college. I lived in a tent for the week in the middle of the desert. And it's spring break, so it's hot. It wasn't like it was cool. Some days it would get into the upper 90s. And then at night, the winds would come howling through. And sleeping in a tent for that long, it kind of wears on you. I don't know. I don't know how you could do that, Pat.
Well, I'm not speaking from experience, so I don't know if I could. But I think the longest I've lived in a tent was probably about a month. But it wasn't exclusively in a tent. It was a tent outside of my grandparents' cabin, so I could go inside. I could do stuff inside during the day. If the weather was really wild, I could sleep inside. So what doesn't really count. But we're talking about the Lord's sacred tent, and the psalm starts off with 2 questions, and then it outlines the type of person that would be allowed to dwell in God's sacred tent. So let's kind of unpack this verse by verse and see how well we kind of line up with what's outlined here.
Yeah, and let me just kind of go to the beginning of it too, because there's a couple things that I think are worth noting, even in the first verse. First of all, when it says Lord, it is talking about the specific name of God. So when it says, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Well, whose sacred tent? It's the specific God of the people of Israel. And the name is the name that we use is Yahweh. Now, Jewish people, for a long time, still today, depending on their tradition, don't use God's name. You don't ever say God's actual name. And so typically when reading, you might say, I think Adonai might be the right term to use, or a different name. We use the word Lord a lot as the way that we say the specific name of God. But it really is like if you go back to the original language, it is Yahweh that we're looking at, which is God's name. So this is specifically God's tent. This isn't a God's tent or just God in general. This is the specific God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
And we kind of know that because it's the all capital lettered Lord, but it's in the smaller font, right?
Yes, that's right. The NIV does that, and I appreciate it because there's plenty of other words for Lord, and they kind of just get used interchangeably. But it is good to note that we're talking about a specific name of God. And it says, who may dwell in your sacred tent, who may live on your holy mountain. The sacred tent, this is actually like a real thing. I mean, maybe it's metaphorical, but it can also actually be what was called the tabernacle. But before the temple was built, and we know that David didn't build the temple, but before the temple was built, God, when they would worship God, they would do so at the tabernacle, and it was like a tent. They would basically kind of build up this portable kind of think of like portable temple. If you ever get a chance, all those of you who are out there, you can look it up on Google even, and maybe see if you can see a picture. There are people who've done pictures of what the tabernacle. Yeah, just look up tabernacle, and then you could even do like a Google image search, and you'll get some like old school pictures of stuff. And it's a tent. Like it kind of just looks like a big tent. And if you look around, you can even find some pictures where there's tents around the tent. So you might even see in Scripture, sometimes it'll be referred to as the tent of meeting. And so when all of God's people would come together to make sacrifices, to basically go to church, so to speak, or during festival seasons, they would do so at this sacred tent, this holy tent. So, yeah, kind of a cool idea.
Yeah.
But then it says, who will go on, or who may live on your holy mountain? What exactly could that mean, right? What is God's holy mountain? Well, we know that David lives in Jerusalem, or eventually he will live in Jerusalem, which is kind of elevated. And we also know that God has met people on the mountain. So if you think about like Moses climbing up Mount Sinai, or you think about Mount Ararat or Bethel, or all these places that are significant mountains that are climbed where people meet with the Lord. And if you think about that, we realize that here in Scripture, there are some places that are I think someone once referred to them as thin places. They're places where it feels like the separation between us and God is less. So for us, that might be like camp, right? There are places that are like that, but the question that I think is being asked is like, who's allowed to go there? You know, who's allowed to enter into the temple? Who's allowed to enter into or go up to the holy mountain? And we know like when Moses went up the mountain to talk to God, people were not allowed.
Right.
It was like, no, you guys stay back.
One-on-one experience.
Yes. It's just Moses going up. He's the only one who's allowed to. Everyone else, you guys got to stay back. And so here in this passage in Psalm 15, the question is being asked is like, who in the world can approach God? And it's not just approach God; it's the word dwell, right? So like, this is like, yes, it's interesting. The definition of the actual Hebrew word for it is to dwell as an alien and dependent. So if someone's going to dwell in the house of the Lord, it means you're going to be dependent on God. It's not like you're going to be a part of the household. It's like you're living there as someone who's totally dependent on God.
It sounds more like it's more intense than like a roommate. It's not like your buddy that you're living with. It's more intense
like a house
than
guest
that.
or something. Yeah, it's kind of like a permanent house guest. I don't know. A roommate kind of does their own work. This is more like, God is gonna invite you in, and you get to be a guest. But as a guest, you're totally dependent on God. Anyway, that's kind of another thought. But it's not like a temporary thing, right? Like, Lord, who may show up in your sacred tent, who may kind of hang out on your holy mountain. It's who's going to dwell there, stay there for a significant amount of time. Who's going to live, like settle in God's holy mountain.
Right.
Kind of like that idea. So you think about like back in the day in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies, once a year, the high priest was allowed to go in and to make sacrifices to the Lord into the Holy of Holies. Now, this is someone who's been like cleansed, who's gone through all these processes. This is like the most righteous person in the land they would allow to go in, and only once a year. But David is asking a question like, who can actually go in and live with God in God's house? And then he comes up with the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. He outlines it in the next 4 verses. Short and sweet, too. I mean, he doesn't... I'm sure, you could write pages and pages, chapters and chapters on specifics and stuff like that, but he kind of he hits all the points that I think he feels like are important, and they're all super good. Verse 2, it says, the one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart. Okay. Like on paper, it's like that's pretty easy, but I know sometimes I've definitely fallen short.
Yeah, blameless. Whoa.
Speaking truth from the heart, I've definitely spewed some untruth, not from the heart.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that just in this verse too, right? The one whose walk is blameless. Mm-hmm. The word for blameless, you can even translate as complete or unscathed, intact, without fault, free from blemish, impeccable, devout, honest, full integrity, complete. Like all of these words don't really leave room for, a couple of mistakes.
And, biblically, my Bible has a reference saying that Noah was one of those people that was considered blameless in God's eyes, lived a blameless life. And Noah was tasked with a huge project. Build this huge boat, the ark we've talked about before in a Devo, and you're gonna like all humanity is gonna stem from you basically,
right?
And so we have ties to that. I just think that's an interesting connection.
Who's allowed to come in here? Well, it's someone who's blameless, who's righteous, and then also who speaks the truth from their heart. Now that's a difficult thing to do. It's one thing to speak truth because you know it. It's another thing to speak truth from your heart, from your conscience. Like the truth is living in you and it's coming out of you.
Right. You kind of have to know it so well that it's the default of everything that you speak. It's not, you don't get asked a question and formulate the right response. The right response is your gut reaction and just completely like kind of spews out. It's like a way deeper understanding of truth.
And then as we keep going here, we see that it's someone whose tongue utters no slander. Now, this is a hard one, right? Because slander is something a lot of us do, and I think we don't even think about it. Like if you think about everything that you do online, or every time you've quote unquote thrown shade at someone, one way or the other, if you do that at all, that's kind of, I hate to say it, but that's become kind of normal
in the day and age of social media. I can kind of see that. Some people, they'll do up their images or pick the best ones and kind of post the best of the best. Not necessarily for the memory later looking back, but for the reaction of others to kind of maybe brag or get a response, stuff like that.
Yeah, or especially when you don't know someone at all, right? That's like on social media. What's funny is I don't see students doing this as much as adults. Students are pretty, and just all you young people out there, I've seen this in you guys. You're very careful about saying bad things online because you know it lasts forever. Adults, for some reason, there's some people out there who are just real quick to get real feisty online. Facebook seems like it's a battleground for people who are just ready to fight about something.
You know, our students don't know what Facebook is.
Yeah, I know they don't. They're like, oh, that's that social media thing grandma uses.
Right.
Yeah, I know.
But that's the way it is. You know, some people they don't realize that what they're saying on a social media platform, someone else who is a human is going to read it and might react to it, or might be offended, or might be sad or hurt or upset. That's something that is often forgotten, that on the other end of the screen, there's a human just like you and me.
And I'm wondering, have you ever met someone who their tongue has never uttered any slander, they've never done wrong to a neighbor, and they don't cast any slurs on others, right? They're not down talking anyone. Now, when I think of someone like that, I'm like, that's the kind of person I want to hang out with.
Yeah.
That's the kind of person I want to have as a friend.
I don't know if I've ever met that person. You know, Jesus is kind of the one that matches that. Or, you know, as like it said, Noah, I would have loved to have been Noah's friend. That would have been awesome. Because we know he encompasses all of this.
I think of my dad. And I say that because when my dad passed away in January, after about a year battle with cancer, and at his memorial service, another pastor was there, and the pastor gave a eulogy, and part of the eulogy he said, you know, when pastors get together, do you know what we talk about? And everyone in the audience was kind of like, oh no, maybe they talk about the Bible, maybe they talk about like church. He said, we talk about you. And he pointed at the congregation. He's like, pastors get together and they talk about the congregation, and they give all their complaints they have of, you know, all the people in the congregation who have done them wrong or done the wrong thing, or they're frustrated with people. And he said, but whenever I met with your dad, talking about my dad, he said he never, not one time did he do that. He would never talk bad about the congregation. And I thought, I mean, to me, that was like convicting. I'm like, whoa, like I didn't. And then I started to think about it. I'm like, you know what? That's true. Whenever I would talk to my dad about people in the church, not one time, not once did I ever hear him get frustrated with a person, get angry at someone, talk bad about them. He might say like, oh, this person needs help. But he never would slur someone or slander them. At least to me, I never heard it. So that, you know, that jumps out at me when I think about that. But so it's one thing, like verse 3, right? It's one thing to stay away from doing wrong. But verse 4, it kind of gets into a different frame here, right? Who despises a vile person, but honors those who fear the Lord. So these are active things that this person does. So they despise a vile person. And, you know, a lot of times we're just told like, oh, vile people, just stay away from them. You know, just keep them at, you know, a distance. Don't deal with them. Don't work with people who are vile. You know, make sure you have good boundaries, people will say. But here it says, despise them, right? It actually is telling us in another way of saying that is to refuse them or to reject them. And so that's like kind of an active thing, to refuse or to reject or to despise a vile person. And then the other side of that, right, is to honor those who fear the Lord. And that's another active thing, to hold someone up in high esteem.
And then, you know, more active stuff after that, who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind. That's, you know, basically saying don't be conditional about the promises you make. That's kind of how I see that. You know, you stick whatever, you know, oath or promise you made and see it through, and don't change your mind.
Yeah. Have you ever had to keep a promise even when it hurt?
I think I fall short on like not changing my mind. You know, I'll often say like, oh, you know, I'm going to do the dishes in the morning, I promise. Or like even for today, you know, I said, I told my wife, Megan, last night we were cleaning our cars and I was too tired to do laundry last night. So I said, oh, just put the towels in the garage and I'll do the laundry in the morning right when I get up. And this morning came and went, and the towels are still out there. So, that's like kind of changing my mind on the oath a little bit, but I also kind of didn't remember. So I don't know. I think I fall short with the changing my mind part more than holding it when it hurts. But I get those, keeping an oath even when it hurts kind of goes hand in hand with changing your mind, because you would change your mind because it would hurt.
To avoid the pain.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. When people say, hey, I'm going to do this, and they do it, there's just something like powerful in that.
Right.
Especially if it's going to cost them something. And I've dealt with, typically it's with people like maybe even in sales, and they make a promise like, I'll give you that car at a certain price, or I told you I would do whatever they would promise. And you realize that maybe they overpromised something and they can't deliver it. And so they try to deliver it. And there's people I've worked with who will stand up to the mistake that they made. And they'll say, you know what, I made a mistake. It's actually, I'm going to take a loss and I'm just going to do it. And I appreciate that about them. Some people will just run away. I had a friend who was getting some yard work done in his backyard, and he was trying to get contractors to come in and get work done. And he had contractors who showed up, and they quoted a quote for him, and they would work. And he had 3 different contractors leave the job they just left the job. Because they realized, this is my guess, they realized that to get the job done, they weren't going to make enough money. And he wasn't going to give them more money because they had quoted a certain price. Mm-hmm. So they just left. And that's not what, the person that God is allowing to dwell in the sacred tent or live on the holy mountain. That's not the same. That's not what that person's going to do. They're not going to leave when things get tough.
And kind of segueing with money, the beginning of verse 5 kind of hits the money topic a little bit too, which, I've talked to some other Christians, and money and what to do with it is a tough topic for some people. And
it is.
This kind of is like a really quick and easy outline. Lend money to poor without interest. Lend money to them, and don't even I see it as don't even try to ask for the repayment to be equal. Give them money and say this is kind of like a gift. If this is going to really help you, do not accept a bribe against the innocent.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, 2 compelling arguments that someone who's going to live in the Lord's tent should do. And I know just from talking to people that these things are difficult.
They're very difficult, to lend money. And this is a great one. Who lends money to the poor without interest? Our lending system right now is set up so that, you have a credit score, and you basically are allowed to be lent money based on your ability to pay it back. Mm-hmm. And so people who have the most money and people who have the most income are the people who can borrow the most amount of money easiest, right?
Right.
And the poor people who don't have money are the people who can't borrow money very well. And what ends up happening is poor people are the ones who end up paying the most interest.
Right.
And how could that be? Well, there's things like payday lending where people some of the interest rates on it are ridiculous, and people are doing predatory lending practices on the poor.
Right.
And it's in that kind of stuff we see here. That kind of stuff infuriates the Lord. It makes me mad thinking about it, but it really wow, it makes God mad because he's comparing it here too, right? To accepting a bribe against the innocent. Also a crazy idea that, in our culture, we don't think, oh yeah, someone's going to pay me money to give false testimony against someone. And that's not about whether you're rich or poor. That's just about giving a false testimony based on money.
Right.
And, I don't know. I don't know how often that happens in our day and age. We probably don't see that as much here, but it does happen. And and I think it reminds us of the 10 Commandments about giving false testimony. It reminds us of how we as people need to tell the truth.
And, David is quoting Exodus 22:25 when he writes this, that says, "If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal.
Yeah.
Charge no interest." And I think that the throwing the word business in there is what makes it kind of real for me. It's like, oh, if you're a business person would go in trying to increase their business, grow their business. And David in the psalm is saying, that's not the goal. That's not what you need to be doing. And then he wraps up the whole thing by saying, whoever does these things will never be shaken. Boom. Simple.
Yeah, you won't be knocked over. Now, here's what's cool about this whole thing. We look through this list. We see all these crazy qualities. And the person that comes to mind for me is Jesus. Because Jesus is someone whose walk was blameless, who did what was righteous. Jesus is someone who spoke the truth from his heart. Jesus didn't slander people. Jesus did no wrong to the neighbors. Jesus didn't cast slurs on people even when they made mistakes. Jesus did despise the vile people, the people who were taking religion and holding it over people's heads to keep them away from God. But Jesus did honor people who did fear the Lord. He kept oaths even when it hurts. And when I think about that, I think about Jesus going to the cross. And Jesus didn't change his mind as he was going to the cross. He kept following it. Jesus didn't have a lot of money, but what he did have, he gave to the poor. And he told others to do the same. And of course, obviously didn't accept any bribes. And ultimately, Jesus was never shaken.
That's all the time we have on this Devo. Thank you for tuning in and listening. And you'll hear from us again on Wednesday.